15 years ago, a black soldier disappeared into the sands of the Sahel. No headlines, no search parties, just silence as if his name was never meant to be remembered. Today, Colonel Traoré steps into the ruins of a forgotten village and finds more than heat and dust. He finds a woman barely breathing, a boy burning with fever, and a toddler clinging to life. But what he holds in his hand, a rusted dog tag with a name from his past, will shatter everything he thought he knew. Because this isn't just about a missing soldier. It's about how a nation forgets the ones who died for it, when their skin is too dark and their rank too low. It's about power that buries truth, and a man who refuses to let it stay buried. What you're about to hear is a fictionalized account, but the pain, the injustice, and the silence it speaks of are all too real. This is not just a story. This is a reckoning. The wind screamed like something alive, sharp, angry, relentless. A swirling wall of sand tore across the Sahel desert, painting the sky in hues of ash and blood. Visibility dropped to near zero. The hum of helicopter blades cut through the howl, followed by the crunch of boots hitting scorched earth. Colonel Traoré stepped out first. His silhouette appeared through the haze like a statue carved from iron posture, straight eyes, scanning breath shallow behind a sand-streaked scarf. Around him, the patrol units spread out like shadows, rifles raised, boots sinking into cracked, bone-dry ground. This was supposed to be a routine check on a long-forgotten village. Just another silent checkpoint on the edge of a map most people didn't even know existed. But something was wrong. The air didn't just burn, it trembled. As they passed a charred acacia tree split clean by lightning or worse, Traoré raised a fist. Everyone stopped. Ahead, what looked like a hut or what was left of one. The roof had caved in. The walls were more hole than mud. Smoke still whispered from the edges, as if the fire didn't want to leave. "Check it," Traoré ordered. Two soldiers moved forward, kicking down the brittle reed door. It collapsed inward with a groan. One of them swore under his breath. Inside, shadows clung to the corners like frightened animals. But something shifted a shape. Small, frail. It was a woman. Eyes, hollow skin, caked with dust and blood. She was cradling a child whose head lolled to one side, limp, burning with fever. At her leg, a barefoot toddler stood silently, wide eyes blinking through the haze, a stick clutched in her tiny fist, like it was the last thing she owned. "Medic," a soldier barked. His voice cracked from dehydration. Footsteps thundered as the unit rushed to the entrance. In the distance, rotor blades grew louder. The chopper was circling back. Someone threw a flare. Red light cut through the sandstorm like a scream in the dark. Traoré stepped inside, and the world seemed to stop. The heat, the noise, the wind all faded as he crouched in front of the woman. He didn't speak right away. Her lips were dry, peeling. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The boy in her arms barely moved. He was nothing but skin and bones. Still, her arms refused to let go. "I need you to hold on," Traoré said, voice steady but quiet. "We have water, food, a medic. We're going to help you." She blinked slowly. Her gaze drifted to his face, then lower his uniform. Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. Her shaking hand reached toward the boy's chest, fumbling. She pulled at a string beneath his shirt and tugged free a small leather pouch worn and dark with age. She opened it carefully as if what lay inside could vanish if handled wrong. A strip of cloth, wrapped around metal. She placed it in Traoré's palm. A dog tag. The edges were rusted, the engraving barely legible, but the name burned through the years like fire through paper, Arago. Traoré's breath caught. His fingers curled around the tag like it might vanish if he let go. 15 years ago, that name belonged to a soldier who had once saved his life, pulled him out of a burning vehicle seconds before it exploded, yelling "move" into his ear as chaos swallowed everything behind them. Maddie, the man who never hesitated, the man who disappeared without a trace, until now. Traoré stood frozen, in his hand a piece of the past. In front of him, the family left behind. Where did you get this?" he whispered. The woman's voice cracked like dry earth. "He gave it to our son, the night he never came back." Behind them, the helicopter finally landed, throwing dust and debris into the hut. But Traoré didn't move. He stared at the boy's face, the cheekbones too sharp, the breath too shallow. This child, this boy, was Mehdi's son, and no one ever came looking for him. The storm outside raged on, but inside that crumbling hut, something else was burning. Memory guilt, and something dangerously close to fury. Who buried his name? Why didn't they tell us? And how many others have we forgotten? The weight of the dog tag pressed into Traoré's palm like a stone carved from regret. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. His world narrowed to that single name, rusted at the edges, but sharp enough to cut through 15 years of silence. Matty Arago. The moment cracked open a memory he thought he'd buried, not because he forgot, but because remembering it hurt too much. The heat that day had been suffocating, the kind that baked through your vest and crawled into your lungs. His convoy had been ambushed outside Cafo Ridge, 3 vehicles, burning bodies everywhere. Traoré had still been a young lieutenant, pinned beneath twisted steel smoke, pouring in ears, ringing from the blast. Everything tasted like ash and copper. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. But then out of the haze a voice, get up, strong hands, an arm grabbing his vest collar. Boots sliding through the rubble, and then the sudden brutal pull, his body yanked from the wreckage just seconds before the second explosion tore the truck apart behind them. They hit the ground hard. Traoré remembered coughing blood in his mouth, Matty slapping his helmet, yelling over the fire. You're not dying here, kid. Move. And then he was gone again, back into the smoke for another man, another life. That was Matty. No rank pride, no hesitation. Just relentless motion. Purpose in human form. They served together on 3 missions after that. Matty wasn't flashy, didn't chase medals, but everyone followed him. There was something in his eyes, something steady like the desert before a storm. He knew how to read terrain like scripture, how to keep his unit breathing in places where most wouldn't survive an hour. And then one day, he vanished. No goodbye, no body, just a silent reassignment order that never added up. Moved north, someone said. Transferred off book, said another. And then, silence. No one spoke of it. Traoré tried once to ask his superior, a colonel who looked away too quickly, and muttered something about bureaucracy. It didn't feel right. But Traoré was too new, too low in rank to dig deeper. And the war kept moving as wars always do, swallowing men and names and guilt with equal appetite. But now the boy, barely breathing in front of him, had his face. The same brow, the same shape of jaw, the same fire beneath the weakness. And the woman worn trembling, holding on not just to a child, but to something sacred she didn't need to explain. Her silence said more than words ever could. She was Matty's wife. These were his children. And the system, the army, the country, he himself had let them fade into dust. Traoré's throat burned, not from the heat or the sand, but from the sudden surge of shame that wrapped around his chest like wire. All this time, he thought Matty had disappeared into the war. Instead, the war had spit him out and no one caught him. He was never reported dead, just forgotten. A name filed away, a body never counted, a family left behind to rot in a place no one patrolled anymore. And Traoré, the man who owed Matty his life, had done nothing. Until now. He looked back at the boy, too weak to open his eyes, and suddenly it wasn't enough to remember. He would make the world remember too. Not just the name, not just the dog tag, the man. The wind outside screamed louder, kicking up sand like fire. But inside, something colder was stirring, the beginning of a reckoning long overdue. The storm was closing in fast, swallowing the sun behind a wall of sand the color of dried blood. The air vibrated with the heavy chop of rotor blades above as the medevac hovered into position. Dust spiraled outward in chaotic spirals, lashing at faces, crawling into mouths and eyes. But Traoré didn't flinch. He stood at the entrance of the ruined hut, arms, steady, boots planted like he belonged to the ground itself. Get the stretcher, he barked. Now 2 medics sprinted forward, one clutching an IV kit, already prepped, the other unfolding a collapsible cot. The little girl cried out as the wind screamed louder, and a soldier knelt beside her, murmuring something soft in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. The woman tried to rise with her son in her arms, but stumbled again, her body too starved, too brittle. Before she could fall, Traoré stepped in. Gently, deliberately, he reached out and lifted the boy from her grip. The child was feather-light, frighteningly so. His heat seeped into Traoré's chest like fire held too long in bare hands. The boy's head lolled back, eyes closed, lips cracked, breath shallow, As the medics secured him to the stretcher and began stabilizing his vitals, Traoré knelt down beside him, brushing dust off the child's forehead with the edge of his sleeve. The sound of the blades pulsed louder now, beating like a war drum in the distance. The world around them blurred, but for a moment time stood still. He leaned closer and whispered low, barely audible over the wind. "Your father saved my life. Now, I'll save yours." He didn't say it for anyone to hear. He didn't even know if the boy could. But the words were more than a promise, they were a debt. And debts in Traoré's world were sacred. Behind him the woman watched without blinking, one hand pressed against her chest, where the boy had lain moments earlier. Her other hand held tight to her daughter's wrist, not like a guardian, but like someone holding on to the only thread left between herself and the living. "Get them on board," Traoré ordered. The team moved fast, carrying the children and their mother to the waiting chopper. The flare on the ground fizzled in the wind. One of the soldiers turned to help the mother onto the ramp, but she waved him off and climbed without assistance, her legs trembling, but her back straight. Then the roar of engines rose and the helicopter lifted from the ground in a blaze of red sand and deafening sound. Traoré stood alone, the wind tugging at his uniform, dust clinging to every seam like memory. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out the dog tag one more time. Madi Arago. The name stared back at him, not etched in metal anymore, but in everything around him: the boy's face, the woman's silence, the injustice in the very air. As the chopper disappeared into the burning horizon, Traoré closed his fist around the tag. His eyes were no longer searching, they were burning. The base was unusually quiet that night. No shouting drills, no radios barking, no idle laughter between tents. The kind of stillness that didn't come from peace but from presence. Something unspoken had entered the camp, and everyone felt it. The woman was placed in a canvas medical tent not far from the command post. A single oil lamp cast a soft gold flicker across the thin walls. Her children were asleep beside her, the boy on a cot, a fresh IV running slowly into his arm, the girl curled up like a kitten at the foot of the bed, one hand still gripping the stick she'd carried through the desert. But the mother, she neither slept nor moved. She sat cross-legged near the wall, back straight, eyes open, fixed on the flap of the tent, as if waiting for something or someone. No one approached her at first. Word spread too quickly. Someone had seen the dog tag. Someone else had recognized the name. Then came the whispers. "That's Madi Arago's wife. Impossible. He's been missing for over a decade." Not missing, erased. The tone changed after that. Soldiers walking past the tent would glance toward it, some pausing mid-step. The young recruits who had never even heard the name before were told in hushed reverence he stood alone so others could live. And now his family was here, real and breathing and silent like ghosts returned from the edge of memory. Later that evening, Traoré stepped inside the tent, a metal mug of warm tea in hand. He didn't announce himself. He didn't wear his medals or speak like a commander. He just placed the cup gently beside her on the ground and sat down cross-legged a few feet away, careful not to intrude. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to fill the silence. He waited. The lamp crackled faintly. The desert wind outside brushed softly against the tent walls. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, her voice came raw and almost too quiet to hear. He said, "Don't stop. Don't look back." She didn't turn her head. Her eyes stayed on the wall in front of her, but her hands folded in her lap tightened slightly, as if the memory still had weight. "So I didn't," she continued. "For years." Her voice was not broken. It was held together too tightly. "We were told to run." Smoke was already rising from the hills when he came home. "He had 2 days with us. That's all." He sang to our son, kissed my stomach. A pause. Her breath shook once, barely. He said he'd hold them off long enough for us to reach the ravine, that they'd follow him instead. And I believed him. I always did. She reached up and brushed something off her cheek, not a tear, just dust. "We hid in a cave. I gave birth early. He never came. No one did. So we kept running, from the hills to the dry riverbed, from one burnt-out village to another. Every place we went, we carried his name like a wound." Traoré didn't speak. His chest ached in a place uniforms couldn't protect. "No one cared," she added. "I tried once. Went to a checkpoint. Told them who I was. They laughed, said there were no records of any Urago stationed in that sector. Her voice didn't rise. That was what made it worse. There was no anger, just absence. I stopped saying his name. I stopped saying mine too. Traoré looked at her at the way she sat perfectly still like carved stone, weathered by a decade of wind. He leaned forward slightly, his voice a low echo. I owe your husband my life. She didn't react. I should have found you sooner. She blinked just once. You didn't want to be found. Did you? This time her gaze shifted just a little, then drifted back to the tent wall. No, she said finally. Not until now. Outside, the night deepened. The wind slowed, but inside that canvas shelter, something ancient and quiet had stirred. Not forgiveness, not grief, something older. Recognition. The next morning the wind had calmed, but the village still breathed in fragments. Charred wood, collapsed walls, and ash-blackened stone marked what had once been homes. The silence was no longer violent, just hollow. A team of field engineers moved carefully through the ruins, mapping debris, checking for structural hazards, and clearing the way for potential rebuilding. It was the kind of work done quickly without fanfare, except when something unexpected surfaced. One of the junior engineers, a boy barely old enough to remember the start of the war, was clearing a collapsed corner of a hut when his spade hit something soft. Not stone, not bone. Leather. Old and dry, wrapped in torn fabric hidden beneath layers of dirt and dust. He dropped to his knees and uncovered it gently. A weather-worn satchel, its strap brittle, the buckles rusted shut. He called for a supervisor. Within the hour, the bag was in Traoré's hands. Back at base, the sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the desert in bruised oranges and dull gold. Soldiers gathered around the central fire, not for warmth, but for what they knew was coming. Word had spread, quietly. A satchel, a letter, a name. The mother sat nearby, wrapped in a heavy blanket, her eyes unreadable. Her daughter curled against her side, already half asleep. Her son remained in the medical tent, stabilized, sleeping under a slow drip of fluids in cautious hope. Traoré sat closest to the flames, the satchel in his lap. He opened it with careful fingers. Inside, a folded photograph, edges curled and ink faded. A child's drawing, clumsy but bright, a stick figure man, holding hands with a smaller one beneath a sun. And finally, a letter. It was sealed with military tape, aged and cracked. Traoré hesitated before breaking it. The paper inside was yellowed but intact. The ink, though slightly smudged in places, still held its form, clean, deliberate handwriting. He unfolded it, adjusted his position near the firelight, and began to read. To my children whose faces I may not see again. The fire popped as if it too was listening. If this letter finds you, it means I did not return. I'm sorry. I wanted more than anything to watch you grow, to be there to braid your hair, to teach you how to fight only when necessary, and to remind you that the strongest people are those who protect, not punish. No one moved, no one breathed. I didn't run. I stood. I stood between fear and freedom. I stood in front of families who had no weapons. I stood beside men who were scared, but never let it show. I stood because, if I didn't, someone else's father wouldn't make it home. A soldier across the fire clenched his jaw, eyes glistening. I carried your names in a scrap of cloth inside my chest pocket. Every time the world got too loud, I placed my hand over it and remembered why I was here. Not for medals, not for orders. For you. The flames leaned sideways in the breeze as if bowing to the words. If they forget me, it's okay. But don't let them forget you. You are the reason I stood. You are what makes fear too small to matter. Traoré's voice wavered. He stopped reading. His hands trembled. Around him the silence deepened, not empty, but full of something sacred. Reverence, grief, pride, all tangled together. The woman brought her hands to her face, not to cry. She had done enough of that in silence, but to hold something breaking open within her. The other soldiers looked down away into the fire, anywhere but at each other. Even the youngest among them, boys too new to carry scars, felt the weight of what had been spoken. Traoré folded the letter slowly, pressing it flat, as though afraid it might dissolve. He stood, held it in both hands, and spoke not to the crowd, but to the night. He didn't just die, he gave. And now, so must we. No one answered. They didn't have to. Because in that moment, under a bruised sky, and the fading crackle of flames, Madi Arago was no longer forgotten. The sun rose slowly over the camp, its rays still soft, but already tinged with the dry promise of heat. Soldiers moved in quiet rhythms, cleaning gear, preparing rations, checking the perimeter, but something in the air had changed. After the letter, no one looked at the woman's tent the same way. The wind still whispered through the canvas, but it carried with it the weight of a name that now meant something more than memory. In the medical unit, the boy was sitting up for the first time, weak but awake. A nurse helped him sip warm broth through a tin straw, his eyes flickering between drowsy and alert. He looked around as if trying to memorize everything, the sounds, the smells, the rhythm of life around him, as if none of it could be trusted to last. But when the nurse gently suggested he try standing, just to test his legs, the boy smiled softly, nodded once, and reached for the edge of the cot. The moment he put weight on his legs, they buckled like paper. He fell hard. The nurse caught him before he hit the ground, but the boy's face twisted in confusion. First, then pain, and finally shame. His tiny fists clenched as his body trembled under the effort to do something so simple, something other children did without thought. His legs didn't respond, as if they had forgotten how to belong to him. The diagnosis came quickly. The medic pulled Traoré aside. Severe malnutrition, muscular atrophy in both legs, prolonged damage, months, maybe years without proper movement. He might never walk again. Traoré nodded, jaw tight. In the tent, the mother sat motionless, her arms wrapped around her daughter, who clung to her side without a word. When Traoré entered, she didn't ask what the doctor said. She already knew. She had seen the way her son looked away after falling, the way he refused to meet anyone's eyes. Her voice broke the silence, quiet but raw. "I told him his father was strong," she said, eyes fixed on the ground. "I told him he came from someone who stood when others ran, who fought when others hid. I told him he carried that strength in his blood." She swallowed. "But now, he can't even stand. Not even on the land his father died for." The silence after her words wasn't empty. It was sharp, alive. Traoré took a slow step forward. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was steady, not loud, not soft, just certain. "He doesn't have to stand to carry the name." She looked up. "But we'll fight," Traoré said, kneeling beside the cot where the boy now lay, curled facing the tent wall. "We'll fight for every step, every inch, every part of him they tried to break." The woman didn't reply, but her shoulders eased, not in surrender, but in recognition. A breath she'd held for too long finally released. And though her eyes were wet, her spine straightened. Outside, the sun had risen fully. The heat returned. But so did something else. Resolve. The word spread faster than anyone expected, not over radio waves or digital channels, but through calloused hands and whispered names. One elder walked a full day with his cane through the valley. A mother arrived with a baby tied to her back, and grief etched deep into her eyes. Some came in silence, some came singing the old songs, but all of them came to speak. A makeshift tribunal was assembled near the base under the open sky. No walls, no podiums, just a circle of benches and blankets, arranged around a large stone slab that served as a table. Traoré stood to the side, arms folded, face unreadable. He wore no medals today, no symbols of rank. Only a simple shirt sleeves, rolled up boots dusty with the same earth the others walked on. The tribunal had no judge, no jury, just listeners, officers, soldiers' aides from the capital, and a recorder with a camera and microphone that blinked red, documenting every breath. The first to speak was a man in his 70s, his back hunched, but voice unwavering. "I was there," he said, pointing east, "in the village of Ndama when the gunfire started. They told us to flee. Most of us had nowhere to go. Matty stayed behind. I saw him with my own eyes. He stood in the center of the square, alone. He paused as if tasting the memory before offering it to the air. They came with trucks, with rifles, with fire. And he stood, not a word, not a step back. There were murmurs. No one interrupted. A woman followed, mid-30s, with burned scars along her arm. I had just given birth," she said. "The child couldn't feed. I was too weak. Matty brought water. He held my baby while I drank. He told me I had to live, that my son would need the story one day." She smiled faintly, then lowered her head. A boy stepped forward, no more than 12, skinny, nervous, his eyes darting. His voice cracked halfway through. My father was hiding in the hills. Madi gave him his boots, said, "Run faster." My father came back years later, still wearing those boots. A pause. He keeps them in a box. The testimonies came like a slow storm, not loud but relentless. Elderly men, mothers, a girl who couldn't speak but laid a small stone on the table wrapped in a faded cloth marked with the initials MU. Each story layered onto the last, weaving a tapestry that pulsed with pain, reverence, and memory. None of them spoke with drama. No one cried out for revenge. What echoed through the gathering was something quieter, heavier. Truth. Madi hadn't run. He hadn't disappeared into the chaos. He had remained not because he had no choice, but because he made one. He had been a shield when no one else was willing to stand, a protector when the state had already turned away, and then when it was over, no one came back for his name. Until now. One of the officers from the Capitol finally spoke, his voice, tight, uncertain. "These are powerful stories, but there is no military record of his death, no confirmed body, no declaration of heroism." A sharp breath rustled through the crowd. The old man who'd spoken first stood again. This time he pointed not east but down. "No record," he said. "Then perhaps the earth is the only record that matters." He placed his palm against the dirt and said, "This ground remembers him. We all do. And if you need his blood to believe it, it's still here." Traoré didn't speak, but he stepped forward, reached into his pocket, and placed something on the stone slab. Madi's dog tag. The officer looked at it, then at Traoré, then at the crowd. Silence fell, but it wasn't empty. It was the sound of history reclaiming its voice, one that had been buried not by time, but by neglect. And now that voice had returned, not in anger, but in truth. When the official military records arrived from the Capitol, printed in crisp black ink and sealed with the ministry's emblem, they were carried with all the weight of finality, as though truth could be boxed, cataloged, and delivered on demand. Traoré read through the file, slowly, each page a bruise against memory. Name: Madi Arago, rank corporal, status unconfirmed disappearance, presumed deserter. Last known deployment Sector 14E, no confirmed burial, no posthumous citations, no promotions. His jaw tightened. No matter how many witness testimonies he had heard, no matter how many lives had been spared because of Madi's choices, the record remained stubbornly void of recognition. The system had never seen him, not as a hero, not even as a soldier worth remembering. Traoré flipped to the last page. Attached was a brief notation. 2 letters of recommendation, Corporal Urago, submitted by Lieutenant Ndiaye and Captain S. Benham, archived at Outpost 17. Then in red ink facility, destroyed in mortar strike 2011. Records lost, that was it. 2 pieces of paper, likely typed in exhaustion, signed in the dirt, passed through the chain of command. With trembling urgency, were now just ghosts. Burned, erased, as if they had never existed. That afternoon, the tribunal reconvened. The heat was harsher, the sun less forgiving, but the crowd returned a little larger this time. Word had spread beyond the immediate region. Farmers came in from the hills. A few wore worn uniforms, long since faded to gray. They stood at the edges, silent but present. A young officer took the stand, no more than 25, shoulders straight, voice steady, but edged with something brittle. He wore his dress uniform, though the fabric clung awkwardly in the heat. "My name is Lieutenant Diallo," he began. "I served with Madi Arago in Sector 14E. There was a stir in the crowd. Not many from that sector were still speaking. He was listed as a corporal, but rank never mattered out there. Chaos doesn't care about stripes. He paused, letting the words settle. There were days when we had no command. Radios down. Officers dead or gone. We were scattered, scared, barely holding a line against an enemy we couldn't see. And in the middle of all that, it was Madi who stood up. He looked out over the crowd, then directly at the officials seated across from him. He gave orders when no one else did. He organized patrols, assigned watches, rationed food. He made the hard calls. He wrote letters home for the wounded. We didn't care about rank. We needed a leader. There was no embellishment in his tone, only memory. I watched him carry an injured private 2 kilometers under sniper fire. I watched him stand between a village and a machine gun nest, knowing full well he might not come back. The officer's voice caught slightly, but he steadied himself. When he disappeared, We waited for the commendation, the promotion, the name to be honored. But nothing came. He stepped down. No applause followed, just silence heavy and full. Traoré stood holding the dog tag in his palm, pressing it slightly as if to keep himself grounded. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Everyone in that circle understood the truth now. The name Mahdi never wore had already been earned, not by paper but by blood. And the silence that followed was no longer ignorance. It was shame. The final day of the tribunal arrived beneath a pale sky, the horizon blurred in desert heat. The benches had been rearranged into a semicircle. At the center stood a simple podium, and behind it a long wooden table where names were usually spoken with formality and caution. But today there was only one name everyone had come to hear, one that had never been printed in the right place, never spoken in the right room until now. Traoré stood at the podium, eyes scanning the gathered crowd, officers in uniform, villagers in worn sandals, engineers, medics, children clinging to parents' hands. All of them drawn here by the weight of something greater than protocol, a debt owed finally ready to be paid. He held a folder thinner than it should have been. Inside a summary of testimony, the recompiled fragments of a life pieced together from memory, courage, and loss. He placed it on the table and spoke, his voice calm but steady, each word measured like a step in sacred ground. We can't rewrite every file, he said. We can't restore the names lost in fires nor bring back what was stolen in silence. But we can fix this one. He looked up, gaze unwavering. And so we will. He turned toward the national representative seated beside him, a civilian dressed in pale formal linen, visibly moved but composed. She stood, cleared her throat softly, and read from the parchment in her hands. By unanimous recommendation of this tribunal and formal decree of the Defense Council, the military record of Corporal Mahdi Arago shall be amended as follows. Posthumous promotion to the rank of Sergeant First Class. Citation for acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty. Name entered into the National Archive of Fallen Defenders. And recognition as protector of civilian life in active conflict. A murmur rose from the crowd, not loud, not triumphant, but reverent. Behind the table, a black cloth was pulled aside to reveal a bronze plaque freshly cast, mounted on sandstone. The engraving was simple, but its presence rippled through the air like thunder in the distance. Mahdi Arago, Sergeant First Class, posthumous, defender of the people. He stood when others fled. He protected what others abandoned. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the mother stepped forward. She was barefoot, wrapped in white, her daughter's small hand tucked into her own. She didn't cry. She placed her palm on the plaque, closed her eyes, and whispered something only the desert wind could carry. Nearby, the young boy sat in a wheelchair watching, his legs still fragile but his back straight, his hands resting calmly in his lap. Traoré walked over, knelt beside him, and leaned in. Your father never wore the name, he said quietly, but he earned it, and now the whole country will know. The boy didn't reply, but he nodded once, slowly, solemnly. And somewhere in the silence between sand and sun, a name once buried had finally been returned to the earth, not as a secret, but as a legacy. 3 weeks after the tribunal ended, the capital buzzed with an energy it hadn't known in years. For once, it wasn't driven by scandal or war, but by something far rarer, unanimous moral clarity. What began as a footnote in a long-forgotten file had grown into a reckoning, but Traoré knew remembrance alone wasn't enough. Recognition was only the first step. What mattered next was prevention, not of war, but of forgetting, not of death, but of abandonment. He stood before the National Defense Committee with a proposal titled in bold, clean letters, the Ouedraogo Protocol, named not after a general or president, but after the boy who had once collapsed from hunger on the ground his father died defending. The document was 34 pages long, but its message was simple. No child of a fallen soldier will ever go without food. No widow will ever beg for medicine. No family will be left behind in the wake of sacrifice. The core of the protocol guaranteed 3 things. 1. Automatic health care for the immediate family of any service member killed or incapacitated in action. 2. Tuition and full educational support for their children from primary school through university or technical training. 3. Monthly stipends indexed to cost of living transferred directly, no middlemen, no bureaucracy. For years, attempts to pass similar reforms had failed, buried under committee votes, budget excuses, or political fatigue. But something had changed. Mari's name had changed it. The recordings of the tribunal had gone viral across the country. The plaque unveiling had been televised, and in one of the most shared clips, Traoré's voice was heard saying, "We can't undo the silence, but we can break it permanently." On the morning of the vote, Traoré entered the Parliament Hall, not in dress uniform, but in a simple olive shirt and desert boots, the same ones he'd worn the day Mari's son had fallen. The floor was tense. Eyes turned as he entered. He carried nothing but a pen. The vote passed not unanimously, but with a majority so overwhelming that even the opposition stood to clap. Later that afternoon, in a modest ceremony outside the military hospital, a wooden table had been set up beneath a flowering neem tree. Sunlight dappled the stone wall behind it, and in front sat 3 metal folding chairs. In the center, a fourth draped in white linen. On it lay the protocol documents. The widow sat silently, her daughter beside her, hair, freshly braided dress too big, but clean and pressed. The boy, his legs still weak but wrapped in braces, now sat upright in his new wheelchair. His face unreadable, not cold, not joyous, simply still. Traoré stood before them. "This isn't just about your father," he said quietly, his voice carrying only as far as it needed. "It's about every soldier who stood and was forgotten. It's about never letting their families carry the burden alone again." He turned to the page, uncapped the pen, and signed his name. The moment was not theatrical, it was deliberate and final. As he placed the pen down, the crowd of witnesses, civilians, soldiers, reporters, hospital workers all remained silent. Then slowly the widow approached the table and placed her hand over his signature. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The boy looked up at Traoré and nodded once. And just like that, a new chapter had begun, not carved in marble or shouted through microphones, but born from pain, shaped by duty and signed in daylight where everyone could see. In the days that followed the signing of the Ouedraogo Protocol, the ripples began to spread, not with parades or headlines, but through gestures so quiet they nearly passed as whispers. Yet those whispers moved like wind through dry grass, igniting something old and buried in the soul of the nation. At military bases across the country, the new policy was read aloud during morning assembly. Some commanders recited the decree mechanically, their voices stiff with the discomfort of change. Others spoke with unexpected softness, pausing at the name Ouedraogo as though it had always been there, but only now granted permission to echo across formation grounds. Soldiers stood at attention, sand dusting their boots, listening not just to regulation, but to recognition. In a rural classroom 3 provinces away, a school teacher named Madame Abbé placed a faded photo above her chalkboard, a printed still from the tribunal broadcast showing Mari's widow standing beside the bronze plaque. Beneath it she had written in white chalk, "Courage doesn't need witnesses, only memory." Her students, many of whom had siblings in the army or fathers they never met, stared up at the image in silence. No one asked why it was there. They already knew. Elsewhere in places, the central government rarely remembered. Widows gathered at dusk not by coordination, but by instinct. In backyards, on crumbling porches, at graves unmarked by official status, they lit candles. Some placed photos beside them. Others said prayers. One whispered, "He stood for all of us," before blowing out the match and stepping back. The light flickered across doorways like quiet defiance. At a small field clinic in the northern district, the boy Mari's son now went by a new name. Not legally changed, but offered and adopted by those who treated him. Le Petit Sergent, the little sergeant. His legs remained weak, but he was learning to move again, inch by inch, step by shaky step. And when he stumbled, he didn't cry anymore. He clenched his jaw and tried again. A physical therapist remarked that he moved like someone who thinks the ground owes him nothing, but he'll earn it anyway. One morning, without announcement, a car pulled up outside the clinic. It was an older government vehicle, the kind only driven by men who had once worn medals heavy enough to bend posture. A retired general stepped out, walking slowly, cane in hand. He didn't ask for cameras. He didn't speak to the press. He simply entered the clinic, asked for the boy, and sat beside him in silence for nearly an hour. When he left, he placed a metal box on the windowsill. Inside, a weathered bronze star and a folded note that read only, "To your father," from a soldier who should have spoken sooner. That photo of the boy holding the box while sunlight hit his face just right would go on to be shared thousands of times. Not by news outlets, but by strangers who added only a caption. We remember. Traoré, for his part, refused interviews. He stayed at the base working late, answering letters from soldiers' families now flooding in. Some told stories. Some asked for help. Some simply said thank you. At night, he returned to the same bench beneath the neem tree where the law had been signed. The breeze still carried the smell of dust and distant fire. He'd sit there with a mug of black coffee and stare at the stars, wondering how many names were still buried, how many stories had no plaques, how many Mati Uragos were still waiting beneath silence. But in those moments, he didn't feel hopeless, because the silence had cracked, because the name had spoken, and because the echo wasn't fading, it was growing. The rehabilitation room was quiet that morning, save for the soft hum of ceiling fans and the creak of old pulleys used in physical therapy. Pale light filtered through canvas shades, dancing across tiled floors, worn smooth by years of footsteps, though for one boy today would mark his very first. Mati's son sat at the edge of the padded bench, metal braces laced up tightly over thin calves, his hands gripping the parallel bars in front of him. Beside him, the therapist crouched low, giving gentle instructions, though the boy didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed straight ahead at the yellow line painted on the floor exactly 2 meters away. On his chest, secured to a simple leather strap, the Medal of Valor hung proudly oversized for his frame, but weighted with meaning. It bounced slightly with every breath he took, tapping gently against his ribs like a heartbeat. The room held its breath. He placed one foot forward, wobbled, caught himself, another. Ankles shaking. The bars trembled slightly under his grip. The therapist moved to assist, but the boy shook his head once firmly. Not this time. And then the third step. No stumble. No hands. Just motion. His back straightened. He walked, only 3 steps, but the room erupted. The staff clapped, someone cried, and a medic in the back whispered, "He did it." The boy, sweating and pale, turned to sit but didn't smile. Instead, he touched the medal on his chest and looked at the camera in the corner of the room, blinking red, recording everything. The next morning, the video hit the public feed. No music, no edits. Just a boy steadying himself, metal thumping softly against his chest, and the sound of his small, determined breath. It spread like wildfire. Across cities, towns, and forgotten provinces, the footage was played and replayed. On train station monitors, in school courtyards, even in military briefings where hardened men found themselves suddenly quiet. But the moment that defined it came far from screens. In a mining town deep in the south, the kind of place maps forget, a girl barely old enough to tie her own shoes sat beside her, grandmother eyes glued to a grainy replay on an old tablet. When the boy took his final step, she leaned close and whispered, "He stood again." Her voice was small, but the truth inside it was not. That line, captured by a teacher nearby, was posted to a national forum, and the country listened. Some reposted it with the tag, "He stood again." Others painted it on walls. One activist scrawled it across a fallen billboard in the capital. Not just once, not just then. He stands still. Traoré watched the spread from his office jaw, clenched throat tight. He didn't celebrate. He remembered, because in that tiny step was everything Mati had died for. And in the silence after it, a nation had begun to rise too. The envelope arrived at dawn, no seal, no stamp, no courier badge. Just a single folder slipped under Traoré's office door, while most of the camp still slept. The handwriting on the label was unfamiliar. Inside, there were no greetings, no context, only hard data. Satellite timestamps, recon notes, internal memos, and one phrase circled in red, "Asset destabilized, acceptable loss." He read it once, then again, then he sat in silence. The report, compiled by a junior intelligence officer now unaccounted for, outlined what had never been spoken aloud. Mati's unit had been sent into a compromised zone, not because of tactical necessity, but to clear ground for a mining contract, not a government operation, not even a sanctioned military push. It had all been set into motion by a foreign-linked resource conglomerate, Psyllium West Extraction, a company known for its glossy brochures and vague promises of infrastructure investment. Buried in the pages were emails between executives and mid-tier officials. In one, a regional administrator agreed to strategic silence in exchange for expedited rights to exploratory drilling, Traoré felt his stomach turn. Mahdi's final position, Sector 14E, wasn't a random assignment. It had been marked as unstable, deliberately starved of supplies, and watched closely. When the ambush came, no reinforcements were dispatched, and afterward, the report noted clearance of dead or deserting personnel recommended. Mahdi hadn't just been abandoned. He'd been sacrificed. Traoré closed the file slowly, palms pressed against its edges, as if trying to keep it from erupting in his hands. The room felt colder. Outside, the sun was rising, its light slanting across the dust-covered window pane. He picked up the phone. Not the public line. The direct one. "Get me Major Kamal, and no record. This stays in the dark." 2 hours later, a silent inquiry was underway. No written orders, no committee meetings. Just trusted personnel tasked quietly with tracing the money trail. Every bribe, every signature, every vanished message. They would work in silence off the grid. No one was to know, not even the media. Especially not the media. When Kamal arrived, still in plain clothes, eyes shadowed with understanding, he asked the one question no one had dared before: "Do we take it public?" Traoré didn't hesitate. Not yet. Truth without proof is just noise. And they have more lawyers than we have soldiers. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out toward the clinic, where Mahdi's boy now trained daily with braces on his legs. A boy who had already survived more war than most men. "They already took what mattered," he said. Kamal remained quiet. Traoré turned voice low. "Let them come." The silence between them was thick. Not with fear, but with resolve. What had started as a personal reckoning was now a political firestorm waiting to ignite. Traoré knew the cost. His position, his name, maybe more. But the file in his hands was heavier than reputation. It carried every face that had been erased for profit. This wasn't about Mahdi anymore. This was about how many Mahdis there had been, and how many were still out there walking into danger for flags that flew over signatures they would never see. That night, Traoré made only one addition to the file, a handwritten note clipped to the final page. "For every truth buried in silence, there will come a voice loud enough to unearth it." He slid it into the drawer and locked it. And outside, beneath a cloudless sky, the wind began to shift, not violently but steadily, as though the land itself was preparing for what came next. The sun had begun its descent behind the low, jagged hills when she entered his office. No guard stopped her. No aide announced her name. She didn't knock. She walked in as if the space owed her silence, and it did. Traoré looked up from a stack of marked folders. His uniform jacket was draped over a nearby chair, sleeves rolled, collar undone. Fatigue lived in the corners of his face, but his eyes were still sharp. He stood as she entered, unsure whether to offer a greeting or an apology. She spared him neither. Her voice came low, controlled, the kind of stillness that only exists at the edge of a storm. "Don't turn him into a statue." Traoré blinked. What she stepped forward, her eyes not accusing but unflinching. "Don't turn Mahdi into a monument. He was a man, a father, a husband." He laughed too loud at his own jokes. He hated the taste of mangoes. He snored. He made promises he couldn't always keep. She paused, her gaze steady. He wasn't made of bronze or slogans. He bled. He feared. And he stayed, not to be remembered, but because he thought no one else would. Traoré looked away, not out of guilt, but weight. Slowly, he lowered himself back into his chair and folded his hands. "I know." She didn't move. "I've seen the press," she continued. "The plaques, the headlines. Hero of Sector 14E. Symbol of reform." They quote him like he was born in legend. But they didn't carry his name for 15 years. I did. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "They're building a school and naming it after him. But none of those people held our son while his body forgot how to grow." Silence filled the room like fog. Then Traoré spoke, not defensively, not officially, but honestly. "I'm not doing this for headlines." She arched a brow. He stood again slowly and walked to the far wall, where the now famous dog tag hung in a shadow box. He stared at it a moment, then turned back to her. "The day we pulled your boy from the sand, I made him a promise. I told him he carried the name of a man who saved my life. But I also told him," his voice softened, "that no more children should have to walk in the dark." He took a breath. "I meant it." She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable, not cold, not warm, just deeply exhaustingly human. Then she stepped forward slowly and reached into her satchel. From it she pulled a small creased photograph, Maddie holding their infant son, both of them laughing, sand in their hair. She placed it on his desk. "If you want to honor him," she said, "start by remembering that he smiled." Then she turned and left without waiting for a reply. Traoré stared at the photo, the boy's laughter frozen mid-burst, Maddie's eyes squinting with joy. Not as a soldier, not a statue, but a man. And for the first time in weeks, Traoré let himself sit in that silence and grieve. There were no breaking news banners, no microphones thrust into faces outside courthouses, no commentators offering hot takes about what it all meant. The verdict came and went like a breeze through dry grass, soft, almost invisible, but unmistakably real. Cillian West Extraction was convicted in a closed military tribunal, charged with corruption, illegal political interference, and conspiracy contributing to the death of enlisted personnel. The decision was final. No appeal was granted. The company's regional license was revoked, its mining operations were halted, its assets, both physical and financial, were seized under emergency powers related to national security violations. But the headlines that followed were strangely muted. A few scattered outlets published the story in small print. Some buried it beneath sports scores and celebrity gossip. Others ignored it entirely. Too complicated, too political, too inconvenient. And that was just fine with Traoré. He hadn't pursued this justice for the cameras. It wasn't vengeance. It was a door quietly closed behind a name that had already been buried once. Inside his office, a spreadsheet flickered on his screen, rows of numbers line items allocations. His team had prepared a report outlining how the seized funds could be rerouted into defense maintenance, tactical modernization, and emergency procurement. He deleted it and opened a new file. Title: Community Restoration Initiative, Phase 1. He moved 10% of the seized funds into a newly formed account under civilian oversight, earmarked not for war, but for the wounds it left behind, housing for widows and displaced families. Not barracks, not shelters, homes with bedrooms and bookshelves and front doors that locked from the inside. Places where memory could live without fear, where the children of the forgotten could grow into something more than ghosts of uniforms never returned. The first village selected was just 30 kilometers from the place Maddie had fallen, a spot still marked by the foundation of his last stand, where the dust still whispered of choices made in silence. A local builder himself, the son of a deceased corporal, was contracted to oversee the work. Labor was sourced from within the community. Women, veterans, and teenagers too young to enlist but old enough to carry bricks all came together not out of obligation, but belief. They called it the second step, a name whispered by a boy in therapy who had once fallen, then stood again. When the first set of keys were handed over, Traoré didn't attend a ribbon cutting. He didn't pose for a photograph. Instead, he sat in his office, coffee cooling beside him, eyes on a letter he kept folded in his drawer, Maddie's letter to his children. His thumb ran over the words once more. "If they forget me, it's okay, but don't let them forget you." Justice had been delivered, quietly, but its roots were growing loud, in cement foundations, in window panes reflecting sunlight instead of gunfire, in boys learning to stand without apology, and in the kind of silence that didn't mean erasure anymore, but peace. The road was new. Fresh gravel crunched beneath Traoré's boots as he stepped out of the truck, the dust still light in the morning air. The desert wind, once howling, now passed gently over the low rise that overlooked what used to be a forgotten clearing, a place burned into his memory, not for what stood there, but for what didn't. There had been no buildings, no light. Just a crumbling hut, a broken water jug, and the shape of a mother curled around her children in silence, the day he first saw them, huddled against heat, hunger, and hopelessness. Now standing in that same spot, the sun rose over brick and chalk instead of dust and ruin. A school, 3 classrooms, 2 solar panels, a water tank, and above the main archway, freshly carved into stone, Mariarago School for Courage and Knowledge. The letters were deep and clean, their shadow etched across the entrance, as if the name itself blocked the sun for a moment, not to dim it, but to redirect it. Children were already gathering at the gate, some barefoot, some clutching small plastic bags with notebooks inside. Their uniforms didn't match, and some still wore sandals or scarves their mothers had stitched from old cloth, but their faces were alight with something no force could standardize: curiosity. Inside the courtyard, the widow stood quietly near a garden plot, where students had planted rows of green shoots just weeks ago. She wore a pale yellow scarf and held a woven basket filled with chalk and wooden slates. A few girls ran past her laughing. She smiled but didn't speak. Her eyes scanned the walls as if still adjusting to the idea that these bricks were hers to see, not just hide behind. Traoré didn't approach her right away. He walked the perimeter, slowly taking in the mural painted along the western side of the school scenes. From the tribunal, a boy in braces walking alone, and at the center, Maddie. Not in uniform, not holding a gun, just standing, holding a book in one hand and his son's hand in the other. Inside the main classroom, a quote was written in bold along the front wall in 3 languages. "Courage is the decision to return even when no one is watching." A teacher adjusted a broken chair. 2 students swept the floor. No one saluted Traoré. No one called attention. He preferred it that way. He made his way to the back garden where a tree had been planted in Maddie's memory, neem resilience, still small, but already taking root. Beneath it sat a stone bench, smooth, unadorned. He sat. From this vantage point, he could see it all: the flag fluttering over the gate, the classrooms humming with morning voices, the hills beyond, where patrols still passed. A military vehicle rolled by on the distant road, but no gunfire. No orders shouted, just wind, books, dust, laughter. He placed his hand on the bench, feeling the warmth of the morning sun soaked into the stone. He didn't need to say anything. The transformation spoke for itself. Here on the same earth where fear had once rooted deep, children now traced letters into slate. A woman who had once whispered in the dark now handed out pens. A name that had once been buried was now spoken every morning in roll call, not as a ghost, but as a guidepost. And for the first time in a long time, Traoré let himself hope, not for justice already done, but for what came next, for knowledge born from courage. The courtyard was still. A breeze rustled the neem tree leaves above the school's gate, and in its shade, children sat cross-legged in neat rows. Their uniforms were mismatched, some with patches, others new, but all wore the same quiet anticipation. A small wooden stage had been built the day before, not for ceremony, but for acknowledgement. Today marked the official opening of the Mariurago School for Courage and Knowledge, and though officials had offered to speak, the village asked for only one voice, hers. She stood alone at the base of the steps, one hand holding a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges, the other resting lightly on the banister. A scarf the color of ochre framed her face, and on her chest a simple brooch. Mari's dog tag polished but unchanged. As the crowd settled, she took a breath and stepped up one slow pace at a time, not out of fragility, but out of purpose, as if every step returned a piece of weight she'd once been forced to carry in silence. At the top she waited. Then softly she began. "There was a time when I believed silence kept you safe, that if you stayed low, stayed small, stayed quiet, the world would pass by and leave you and your children alone. But it didn't." She paused, unfolding the paper slowly, though she barely glanced at it as she continued. "They came for my husband's name. They erased it. They came for our roof. It fell. They came for our dignity. We buried it." Her voice, quiet but steady, reached every corner of the courtyard. "But you cannot kill a man who gave everything. You only make his story louder." The words didn't echo, they rooted. Teachers looked down. Some villagers closed their eyes. A child reached for their sibling's hand without being told why. This school is not made of bricks. It is made of names. Yours, mine, his. And from today onward, none of them will be easy to forget. She folded the paper again, tucking it into her sleeve. "If your father was never named, name yourself. If your mother cried alone, hear her now. If you fall, stand again and make sure someone sees." She looked out at the rows of students. Her voice softened. "The world once told my son he might never walk, but now he runs." With that, she stepped down, not slowly, not dramatically, just firmly. Behind her, teachers began to call students forward by name. One by one, they stepped up to receive their first gift from the school, a pencil. Nothing more. But each pencil was engraved not with Maddie's name, but with the name of the child who held it. Because remembrance wasn't just about honoring the past, it was about empowering the present. And as the sun rose higher, the courtyard filled not with applause, but with writing lines of letters, hopeful scribbles, new stories just beginning. The sun rose slow and golden over the compound, casting long shadows across the schoolyard. It was early still, too early for lessons, too early for chores. But the gates of the Mati School for Courage and Knowledge had already been unlocked. In the far corner of the courtyard beneath the neem tree planted in Mati's honor, two children stood hand in hand. The boy, thin but taller, now no longer wore the metal braces that had clung to his legs for nearly a year. The straps had been removed the week before, but this today was the first time he would walk without support. No rails, no wheels. Just him, his feet the earth. Beside him stood his sister, a half step behind but firm, her fingers laced around his with quiet certainty. No adults hovered, no cameras blinked. The moment belonged to them. He looked ahead, not at the building, not even at the children beginning to arrive in loose clusters with satchels and laughter, but at the gates. The same gates where years ago his mother had once crouched in the sand, shielding him from the wind. The same gates where soldiers had once shouted and medics had once landed. The same gates his father had never passed through alive. Now they were just open. He took a breath, shifted his weight, and moved. The first step was hesitant, more sway than stride. The second was better. The third was real. By the fifth, his back had straightened. His sister didn't pull. She just matched his pace. Children along the walkway turned and began to clap, not the wild clapping of celebration, but the soft, rhythmic beat of respect. Their teachers didn't hush them. They let it rise natural and light. Some of the younger students didn't understand why. They clapped anyway. In a room on the second floor, their mother stood by the open window, one hand braced on the sill, the other holding a mug of warm tea that had gone untouched. Her scarf trailed in the breeze and her gaze followed every inch of her son's journey, not in fear, not in awe, but in peace. He reached the gates, stopped, turned, and smiled. She didn't wave, didn't cry. She simply whispered aloud to no one in particular, or perhaps to the memory that always stood just behind her shoulder. You gave us dignity back. The children gave us tomorrow. The courtyard swelled with sound, not speeches, not silence, but laughter. Someone had slipped on a book bag. Another spilled chalk dust. A teacher raised their voice over the chatter, only to be laughed at in return. It was the sound of life moving forward. Below, the boy and his sister stepped through the gate. He didn't stop this time. She didn't let go. And just like that, the future began, not with fanfare, but with footsteps. It is National Heroes Day, a day, once filled with speeches and parades, now reimagined. No podium, no slogans. Only a circle of people gathered in the capital's central square. As the crowd gathers under the rising sun, a lone flutist steps forward. He plays a soft, haunting lullaby, the very same melody Muddy once hummed to his children at night. The notes float gently into the morning air. There are no introductions, no commentary, just memory and sound. Veterans stand at attention. Children hold hands. The president lowers their head. One by one, soldiers raise their hands in salute, not by order, but by choice. No words are spoken, none are needed. Because sometimes a nation rises, not through noise, but through silence. After the ceremony ends, the square empties slowly. Traoré stays behind, sitting for a moment longer on one of the simple wooden chairs placed in the first row. As he leans forward to stand, his hand brushes against something tucked beneath the seat. A folded note written in a child's handwriting, slightly smudged with dust. We miss you, Papa. I walked today for both of us. No name, no signature, but he knows. Traoré holds the note in both hands, reading it twice. His eyes linger on the word both. There's no crowd left to see him. He folds the note gently and places it inside his inner jacket pocket close to his heart. He doesn't speak, but his silence says everything. In the north, where the wind once carried fear, a new village has been built. Simple homes, a school, a clinic, and a garden at the center where laughter replaces silence. The widow now teaches women to read sitting in circles under the trees. She uses old poems, new words, and memories carried in lullabies. Her daughter writes poetry of her own, bold, curious, unafraid. Her son runs freely now, No braces, no hesitation playing ball with the other children. He doesn't speak of the past much. He doesn't need to. He lives the proof of survival. At the village gate stands a plaque engraved not in gold, but in plain, honest words. This ground once carried fleeing mothers. Now it holds their homes. One afternoon, Traoré arrives quietly. No uniform. No escort. He walks alone to the garden, kneels down and touches the earth. He closes his eyes and whispers, "You gave us peace. We'll give them a future." And in that soil, once soaked in fear, something new begins to grow. Sometimes stories of war are told through medals ranks or battle maps, but the story of Mati Urago reminds us that true heroism often lives in the quietest moments, in choices made, with no audience and sacrifices. No one applauded, and in names that were never printed on banners. What moved me most in this story wasn't just the injustice Mati faced, being erased, forgotten, unrecognized, but the strength of those left behind. His widow, his children, and Traoré didn't seek revenge. They chose something far more powerful: to remember loudly, live fully, and build forward. In a world that moves fast, where people in pain are often buried under headlines or bureaucracy, this story offers a rare kind of justice, one that doesn't shout, but heals. The school named after Mati is more than a building. It's a living memory. Every child that learns to write their name there carries a part of his legacy, not because he was perfect, but because he stayed when he could have run. And Traoré, a man who could have buried the truth to protect the system, instead chose the harder path to confront it, to clean up what wasn't his mess, to keep a promise to a dying boy and give meaning to a name that had been left behind. This isn't just about one man. It's about the thousands who've been forgotten, and about the everyday people who choose quietly to carry their names forward through education, compassion, and action. Justice here wasn't a courtroom, it was a classroom, a clean bed, a pencil with a child's name on it. So maybe the question we're left with isn't, will the world remember us? Maybe it's, what will we choose to remember about the world? Now it's your turn. Is there someone in your life, a family member, a mentor, a name history forgot, whose story you think deserves to be told? What would it look like if you were the one to keep that memory alive? Let's talk below. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.